admit a few more people here. Okay. Try to keep that off to the side. That's why we wait an extra 5 minutes, because sometimes it's hard to make it on time. So I can relate. Okay. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. This is the first quarterly ICGC meeting of 2023. Our topic tonight is volunteer management. And for those who haven't been to a discussion before, I should just say that ICGC is an abbreviation for the Indy Community Garden Collaboration. And this is a community-driven group where we discuss relevant topics to community gardeners. We have had discussions on irrigation, zoning, and land use. And now tonight we are discussing volunteer management. So this is these are all very pertinent topics to most community gardens and market gardens, honestly, any kind of growing operation. And so that's why we're having these discussions, because we feel there is a need from talking with community members to dive into these topics. So if any of you have suggestions for future topics, we welcome that input. And with that, I will introduce myself. I am Nick Schwabro. I am a agriculture and natural resource educator with the Purdue Extension Marion County office. My colleague Linda Adams is joining me tonight and sharing some specific perspective from the Bethany Community Gardens garden on the near south side. And I believe Akila from Fletcher Place Community Garden will also share a little bit of her experiencing managing volunteers. So try to advance the next slide here. There we go. And I just put a slide here to inform everyone of the mission of Purdue Extension Marion County. Our goal is to provide relevant and research-based educational services to Marion County residents and organizations who share our passion for building young leaders, creating strong families and healthy communities, developing profitable businesses and trusted employees, and growing a vibrant natural environment. And to that end, we have 4 different areas within our office: agriculture and natural resources, as I mentioned earlier, community development, health and human services, and 4-H youth development. And we all like to collaborate together. We're doing that more and more, especially this year with Junior Master Gardener programming that will be occurring later in the spring, and working with community development to provide a grass to garden program this fall between community development, agriculture, and natural resources. We have a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and we value underappreciated communities and celebrate human differences by embracing and recognizing the need for diverse, equitable, and inclusive structural change. So we are constantly seeking opportunities to partner with all organizations within Marion County, and we welcome any suggestions you have to that end as well. So the outline for this presentation is, it's a little bit wordy on this slide, but I wanted to be specific and what we're talking about here. So I kind of put together this structure, and I threw this image on here because I found it kind of entertaining, the difference between a mechanistic and an organic organizational structure. In my mind, when I was a community garden manager for the IUPUI campus gardens, when I was interviewing for that position, the way the job was pitched to me, it was very mechanistic. It was very top down. I reported to certain people to get permission to break ground on a certain area of the garden, to plant certain crops, things like that. But what ended up being the case once I held the job for several months and then a year was I was letting people know what I was doing, but then they were also asking me, hey, we have this volunteer group. Can they do some work in the campus gardens? Can you help organize them? So point being, no single community garden is going to have the same organizational structure. Garden managers are going to manage volunteers differently. But there are a few points that all successful community gardens, from what I've seen, have in common. And that is a purpose, number one. What is your mission? You know, why is your garden there? What need is it serving? Secondly, defining specific roles for volunteers, I think, is very useful. And cataloging those descriptions, I think, is very valuable, because often when you have new volunteers, I have volunteered in some community gardens where there was not a lot of structure, and there was a goal to maybe harvest a certain crop, but no one knew where exactly they needed to fit in within that task. So for instance, I had the experience where, 5 of us were digging up potatoes, but no one was bagging the potatoes. So at the end, we had all the potatoes dug up, but no one had processed them in the end. So things like that, making sure you have specific details for each position, I think, is very useful. And yeah, making sure along with that, explaining why you need volunteers, making it clear that their time and effort is important. Third, I think something that may not be so evident to some community garden managers, and including myself, is attracting volunteers. Just because you have an operation doesn't mean someone necessarily knows about it, number one, and number two, doesn't mean they'll necessarily be interested in volunteering there. So having some sort of social media presence, making yourself visible at community events, like farmers markets, maybe Earth Day events, any number of different community celebrations. I think that's very useful, tabling. And then also kind of, going back to the old-fashioned flyer, I still think those are useful. I think if you place them in the right locations, they can be very useful in drumming up participation. Retention, that's a huge issue. That's something I experienced firsthand as garden manager at IUPUI. I was always having volunteer turnover. There were about 3 or 4 volunteers that were consistently coming to the campus gardens at least once a week. We had 2 garden work days, and one volunteer in particular, he was always there. He was there every day we had a volunteer work day, and was even messaging me on off days asking if he could do some work in there. That's rare, though. I think it's worth spending some time on formalizing participation. So when a new volunteer comes to the garden, making sure that they're plugged into all of the messaging around that garden from day one, making sure that you're able to obtain some of their information so that you can stay connected. And ultimately, retention is important because the more volunteer turnover you have, the more time you're spending training new volunteers, the less time you're doing actual work in the garden. And so I think retention, and I should say this structure is in no particular order. I think these are all equally important. But if I had to order these, I would say retention would be close to the top. I think it's a huge point. And addressing challenges and concerns. We can't control the weather. We can't control people's schedules. So there will be times when even consistent volunteers are unable to show up to a work day. We have some extreme weather sometimes that can damage crops. These are things that, it really takes some thinking to find ways to address those problems. So having backup plans, being able to reset and reprioritize your work tasks, I think is hugely helpful. And then finally, recognizing volunteers for their hard work. I think this is hugely important, and it's a good way to have good retention of volunteers. And it's good manners, honestly. I think it's really important that volunteers are recognized for the work that they do. So, defining your purpose. What is the mission of your organization? I think, clearly defining what your community garden or nonprofit organization is doing, it's essential. What makes your garden or organization unique? What separates it from the other community garden about half a mile away? Are you growing different crops? Are you serving different food pantries? Is one serving a food pantry and the other one is producing food for a school? Is the main component, the main focus of the garden education or production? These are things to consider when you're thinking about the purpose of your garden. So, and then connecting with the greater needs of the community, I think is very important. And it's not always evident when you're first starting a community garden. I think it takes some time to understand your location, your situation within the community, how you can complement or supplement the work of other community gardens and nonprofit organizations. It's not something that may be obvious in the first or even second year that a garden is in production, but it's definitely something to consider going forward. And then also thinking about health and safety, making sure that that's really a clearly integrated part into the mission of your organization, making sure that, yes, you're doing a service for the community, but you're doing it safely, you're doing it respectfully, so that it's a win-win for everyone. Positions defined, giving clear direction, defining specific tasks for volunteers is essential. It's a good way to keep volunteers engaged. For instance, in the beginning, when you have new volunteers, you want to expose them to as many tasks as possible. And ultimately, I would say if you have regular volunteers that come back year after year, it's a good idea for them to be for them to have an understanding of the entire garden, all of the operations, at least at some level. They may not be an expert in every task, but I think having a general understanding of all the tasks is good, and it could position them eventually to grow into a leadership position. So if you are the garden manager at some point, your life may change. You may not be able to give as much time to the garden as you originally did as manager, and it's always a good idea to have someone in mind that can succeed you. So I think that's it's essential that volunteers have specific tasks, but that they also be aware of the whole operation. And to that end, there may be someone who finds themselves particularly suited to a task in the garden, like pruning, or weeding, or pest management, something like that. Making sure that you understand your volunteer's skill set, I think is beneficial to you, number one, and a good way to keep them engaged again, because you're really you're allowing them to express their professional or personal skills that they have, and I think that's just a great way to keep people engaged. And like I said, a gradual pathway to leadership within the community garden organization, I think that goes along with each volunteer having some understanding of the bigger picture of the space. And if you do have a volunteer that steps into a specific role and is apt at doing specific tasks, I don't necessarily think there's something wrong with them doing that task every workday they're present there, so long as you emphasize that there needs to be a level of flexibility that they have, and so that's where cross training comes in, and really making sure that everyone has a broad understanding. So attracting volunteers. Again, I mentioned I like flyers earlier, so this is just kind of an example flyer, something similar to what I did as a garden manager at IEPUI. On a college campus, it's a lot easier to make a flyer and post it somewhere where it's seen. There are high traffic areas. For a community garden, it's maybe a little more difficult. It's not so obvious where you could post a flyer where people would see it and want to come volunteer at the garden. But nevertheless, I think it's a good idea. Everyone knows about social media. I didn't put any notes on here about social media because I think we're all aware, we can post on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and that's definitely useful as well. I think exploring all the avenues, traditional and newer avenues, are that's where you'll see the most success if you're really engaging all those avenues. So when you're advertising your volunteering opportunities in your garden, I think it's important that you keep in mind the tasks that you need done, but also emphasizing what that garden can offer volunteers. I've volunteered at many community gardens where some of the produce was offered to participants, whether they had been volunteering there for months or years, or if it was their first day. And I always found that an attractive way, personally attractive to me, to come back to that garden space, because if you're giving a little bit of your time, it's nice to get some kind of reward, a vegetable, cucumber, something like that. Nothing too large, just a little bit of something that maybe you can snack on your way home, or that incentivizes you to come back the next weekend. Some maybe more intangible benefits you could get from volunteering are networking with other people that could eventually turn into something tangible, but building relationships. One of the gardens I like to volunteer at has a lot of people in the nonprofit sector. And so as an extension educator, it's really interesting for me to get their perspective on grants and managing nonprofits in that arena. So that's one of the reasons why I like to volunteer in that community garden. Skill building, horticultural skill building, as well as building more soft skills, public speaking, maybe eventually growing into a leadership position where you're a volunteer, a more established volunteer, is managing newer volunteers. Going along with that, task management, having volunteers that you've supervised for some time, taking on some tasks and distributing the work among newer volunteers. Physical exercise, I think that's a huge benefit. And then teaching opportunities. So I guess I should have put learning opportunities. So maybe you as a garden manager have the opportunities to teach volunteers, or maybe the volunteers have something to teach the garden manager. I think that's not uncommon. A lot of volunteers come from different growing backgrounds, and I think everyone has something to offer. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I think tabling at community events, Earth Day events, events centered around horticulture, agriculture, sustainability. I think those are good opportunities to reach out to people face to face. And in my experience, when I've done that, I think that's where you really build the strongest connections. I think social media is a great supplement or complement to that, but I don't think there's much. There's not a good substitute for actual conversation. Farmers markets are another great place if it's possible to table there. There's usually, I mean, there are several farmers markets in Indianapolis that have very high traffic, particularly in the summer months, and the months when community gardens are, getting up and going again. And then again, posting flyers, utilizing co-working spaces, 16 Tech, the AMP, spaces along those lines where there are multiple businesses, and again, farmers markets. So retention. Yeah, why am I always training new volunteers? Part of that may be because the volunteers are getting bored and they want to do some different sort of task, but I have fallen into this situation as a garden manager where it was very easy for me to train 2 or 3 people in a specific task and just have them come to the garden and do that task, week after week. But I think you get volunteer burnout really quickly from that. So again, cross training, I can't emphasize that enough. Making sure that you're exposing the volunteers to all different gardening tasks: watering, planting, pruning, harvesting, cleaning. If you donate to a food pantry, maybe logistical aspects of volunteering. Yeah, and if you find that maybe 1 or 2 or 3 volunteers work well together, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with allowing people to work in the same tasks consistently. But if that group maybe, if it becomes clear that group is kind of excluding other volunteer members, that's something you want to avoid. So, but as long as it's a healthy cooperation and teamwork, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Particularly if someone has a skill set that's suited for a certain garden task. And yeah, kind of along with volunteer groups, creating a mentoring framework for regulars or more established volunteers to mentor new volunteers, I think is important. And understanding how many volunteers you actually need for your growing operation, I think is also important. So, and you may not know that in the beginning as you're creating an organization, an outline structure, or a business plan, however you want to think about your structure for your community garden. But over the course of the first year or 2, or 3 years even, it should become clear what you're growing, how you're growing it, should inform how many people, how many volunteers you need. I have been in a situation where I had too many volunteers and not enough work. It was a rare situation, but that's something to consider. So some common problems include volunteer shortage. I would say that's definitely more of the case than having a surplus of volunteers. And so then it becomes important to think about what tasks can you accomplish in the garden with the number of volunteers that you have. Are you able to reorient your operations to complete some tasks sooner that require fewer volunteers? So I think that's something that definitely needs to be considered. And then I mentioned volunteer burnout earlier. Revisiting growing season goals and expectations. If you have volunteer burnout to the point where a lot of your volunteers are leaving, it's important that you maybe take a look at the goals of the garden, what the expectations are for the volunteers. Are they reasonable? Is it necessary to redefine your goals and your expectations so that you can retain more volunteers and attract new ones? Maybe a volunteer is dissatisfied with the tasks that they're doing. I would say that there are some tasks in all gardens. I'm thinking of weeding in particular. That's one I dislike the most, where a lot of volunteers are not, no one's interested in really doing that. But what's important is always emphasizing the essential nature of all jobs in a community garden. And again, rotating volunteers to different tasks, cross-training, making sure that no one is in a position for too long, making sure that everyone is exposed to all tasks, and expressing empathy, being understanding of someone who maybe is struggling with the task in the garden, offering help. Avoid comparing one task to another in terms of importance. Unless you're saying that all tasks are important, which they are. Everything needs to be done. Everything needs watered, everything needs weeded, etc. And finally, recognition, showing appreciation for volunteers verbally, on an ongoing basis, recognizing volunteers that have been around for a year, several years. When newer volunteers see that, in my mind, that may incentivize them to stick around. I know I felt that way when I would volunteer at a community garden, and after maybe 2 years, the manager said, "Thank you, Nick, for continually being willing to volunteer your time." Designating time for end of season celebrations, utilizing some of the produce that you've grown, whether your garden is a donation garden, or has another maybe an educational purpose. I think it's important to have an end of season celebration, to not only recognize, but to just have fun, to socialize. Can be another networking opportunity. And then kind of going along with recognition, maybe setting some loose outline, basic outline for aspirations, goals, desires for the next growing season. So that way, when you're not seeing volunteers for the next maybe 3 or 4 months, maybe even longer, they can walk away knowing that there is a goal, there are goals, there is a vision for the next growing season. And even if maybe not all those goals are met, at least some of them might come back knowing that their work is still needed, and there's still a purpose for their presence and their volunteering in that garden space. So with that, I will stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Linda, and she's going to talk about Bethany Community Gardens.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Let's see. All right, so are you seeing the, there we go.
There you go. Yep.
Okay, and you're seeing the screen without the notes, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, cool. Hey, all right, it worked. Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Adams. I'm one of the community wellness coordinators that work in the Purdue Extension Marion County office in Indianapolis. And we work inside the Health and Human Services side of Extension, as well as the nutrition education program. So as a community wellness coordinator, we work to make it easier for people to access proper nutrition and opportunities for physical activity. And gardens are a great way to do that. But we often will work with gardens and help get them connected to food pantries. One of the key gardens that I work with is Bethany Community Gardens, which I'm going to share a little bit with you about today. I'll just do a brief overview of where we are and what we do, and then I'm going to dig a little deeper into some of the technology tools that we use in our volunteer management. So let me advance my slide. So Bethany Community Gardens was started in 2018. We're in the South Indy area. So we're down on the south side near where 465 and US 31 come together. We're located on the property of Bethany Lutheran Church, but we are kind of a community-driven outreach. We had a lot of key collaborators and neighbors that participated in the starting of this garden. And we're, I guess, entering into our 6th year. So that's pretty exciting. We did with this garden, we prioritize community building and socializing. So we, especially early on pre-COVID, we had community meals once a month. We offer free gardening classes. We use a regular day of the week and time to do our gardening together, usually Tuesday evenings. And then we also do, like Nick suggested, the end of season celebration and pitch-in dinner. I already mentioned the free gardening classes. In some years, we did the plant starting, which was always really popular. Everybody always loves that. And again, like I said, this is a really good night. A lot of people there in these photos. And here's some pictures from an end of season celebration. This year. We have a couple of key awards that we give. And one is the Phil McCracken Award, which is kind of our stellar volunteer of the year. And then we also have a new volunteer of the year award. And then we have lots of prizes that we share with our volunteers at the end of the season. And then we have raspberries that we grow. So one of our volunteers makes some raspberry jam for everybody. So that's kind of a nice treat. Now, some of the volunteer management and tech tools that I wanted to talk to you about, we really wanted to focus in and reach the South Indy area and the neighborhood in which we were located, but we also wanted to make sure that we got people. So we tried really hard to get the word out that very first year, and really we've done that ever since. We usually, when we're getting ready to do our class series, we try to offer a class series every year. Just kind of basic gardening and refreshers for experienced gardeners. And we kind of advertise it to, for new gardeners and experienced gardeners. The classes are free. We usually will serve a meal with it. And we have worked with some other community businesses or like senior centers and senior living places have sponsored some of the meals that we've offered. And they're usually pretty simple and easy to do. So I will build an Eventbrite. I really like that tool. That's an online application and it helps me. That's what's in the green there. Shows you the, kind of the sign up page. People click it and they can put their information. I'm able to select what we want to gather, like email address, text number. I could even add a question like, how did you find out about us? That type of stuff. And then on the other side there is the flyer that we created for the class this year. So I will also then take it, and the Eventbrite can be connected to our Facebook page. We do have a Facebook page for Bethany Community Gardens. And if you have a Facebook page for your garden, you always want to make sure you have 2 administrators of that so that somebody always has access. to the page and can make alterations. You know, if something happens to somebody or they're unable to help you, then you can easily go in and assign another person to help you with the Facebook page. But so it will connect. You can also schedule Facebook posts in advance. And then if you notice that people aren't signing up or it's kind of dragging a little bit, you can actually pay to boost your posts within Facebook, and it will catch people who are either like in a certain radius of you. And sometimes we catch people who happen to drive through the radius. So every once in a while we might have somebody from Castleton show up. Like, how'd you find out about us? Like, I don't know. I got a Facebook ad that came across. So I'm like, hey, that's cool. Were you on the South Side recently? And they're like, yeah, I was. I'm like, you must have, like, I don't know, drove through our zone and it picked you up. Also work on trying to do a lot of promotion, which is, you know, we want to bring people into our events, which is the key volunteer recruitment opportunity. Down on the South Side, we have 2 community newspapers, the South Side Times and the South Sider Voice. Both of them have community calendars that we can send notices in and have those listed there. I also have worked with the editor at the South Side Times, and we've had a number of articles that will highlight what we're doing. We did that in the very beginning when we first started, and then this one was done within the last year, which was a really great cover story. That was nice. But we also want to support our local newspaper. So we have purchased some ads because we do have some funds to do that with. And they're not that expensive. And so those are some examples of a couple there. This one is a project management software. It's called Basecamp. That is there is a cost to utilize Basecamp. Purdue Extension is able to provide the use of that for me as an Extension employee. And one of the nice benefits of that is that I can invite people who are outside the Purdue system to participate in our little project management. It's kind of like a business, I guess. So you can go in there, we store documents in there, we can communicate with the team. We set up scheduled prompts each week to gather information from our team leads to make our to-do list for our workday. There are other project management tools online in the App Store that you can utilize that do not cost money. This one has been really helpful to us. Again, we like store our crop plan on there. I will keep our grant applications sometimes, and then also copies of our old flyers and that sort of thing. I also have used Sign Up Genius. We generally will use Sign Up Genius every year to handle our watering team because our water team does come out at different times, not just our regular Tuesday night time. So that's been really helpful. We have a volunteer that sets that up for us. And then we also have, we used it during COVID because we wanted to make sure that we stayed in business in COVID. We wanted to make sure we grew produce and got it to our food pantries. So what we did was we used a small team format during that time, and we tried to schedule it so we didn't have more than, say, 8 people at the garden at a time. And then we would spread them out. Our garden is 10,000 square feet, so it's kind of easy to spread people around. But we didn't want to have the big groups during COVID. So Sign Up Genius was a big help during that time. I also utilize Google Docs for tracking volunteer hours and then our harvest amounts. That's been helpful for grant reporting, but it's also, we like to, in my position, I do have to report back to the funders that provide my position. Some of these data, but it's also been really helpful. Excuse me, I'm sorry. It's been helpful, like when we get ready to do our end of the season celebration, we can see who volunteered the most because we've been tracking their hours. We do use a paper book on site at the garden. We've dabbled in some different opportunities, different ways to track our volunteer hours. I guess it's, people who like the garden don't generally like to sit on their computer. So keeping track and logging hours and things like that sometimes might be a challenge for garden volunteers. So we will use a paper book at the garden site, and then we have somebody that can input it into the garden. And then we have another volunteer that does transport our produce to one of our pantry partners. And she goes in and she will log the weights of the harvest and things like that when she delivers it. We've also utilized Excel docs to manage our volunteers and class participants. And then I'm able to use those logs to gather email addresses. And then I use those to send out promotion emails to invite people to our new class series each year. We try to communicate with people, like, if you don't want to be on the list, let us know. When we host an event, we always try to have new people sign in. We have little sign-in cards that we use. Here's another tool that we did. This is stored up on our Basecamp, but this is like our crop layout. It says what's in what row, and we also use it for crop rotation. And then the color coding matches to the team lead that's responsible for that particular crop and row. And we started that during COVID. And what those people do each week is they tell us, they receive an email prompting them to say, what needs to be done in your beds this week. And they will type in what needs to be done in the beans, or, which, the number of the row and what needs to be done in that aisle. And then we can kind of print up a summary of that. And then we have that as a check sheet at the side of the garden. I also hang one of these on the fence, laminated next to the garden, because people are like, hey, what's growing in that row? Well, they can run over and look and see what's there. So that's kind of the end of our technology that we use, and that's been really helpful. We also host corporate and school groups for volunteer days. That's been really helpful. Here's something that I wanted to share with you guys that you might all find helpful. The University of Indianapolis is pretty serious about integrating service learning into their students' education. So they actually have a department dedicated to that. We've worked with them for a long time. We've always had involvement of university students, University of Indianapolis students at our garden. We've also had some professors bring groups of classes for big work days, and that's been fun. But this is kind of cool. I learned about this just recently. They hosted a volunteer sort of fair for their service learning department. And I went, and the students could come around and find out about different volunteer opportunities in the community. So I hosted a table and was able to share, what it's like to volunteer, to give them information to come. But there was other organizations there. So that's something that you guys would be able to do as well. You could connect with Mariana. Her information is there. And then they also have this kind of online, it's like a job board, but it's for volunteering. And it's called Hounds Connect. And Lanny Fowler manages it. And they gave me like there's a QR code thing that you can, and you go in and you set up an account for your organization. And then you can kind of like post volunteer jobs and days and times. I haven't done that. One of our other volunteers has done it for us before, but I'll probably get into it this year and take advantage of getting some students to come on over. Oops, I went too far. That's all I have. If anybody has questions, again, I'm a community wellness coordinator, and if people need, connections regarding food pantries and things like that, we might be able to help you with that.
Yeah, thank you, Linda.
Okay. Need to unstop my share. Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions regarding Linda's presentation or my presentation, you're welcome to ask now. If not, I believe Akila, if you're on, and if you are interested in sharing your experience at Fletcher Place Community Garden, you're welcome.
Okay.
Do that.
Hi, everyone. My name's Akila, and me and my garden partner, Beth Oakville, run a community garden down in Fletcher Place. Our garden is the Fletcher Place Community Garden, and how we get most of our volunteers is word of mouth. People come by and see our garden stand, like, hey, what's going on there? And we give them information of how to volunteer. And sorry for my messy bedroom, but yeah, it's a really great garden, and we're very flexible how we maintain our volunteers. We do an end of year celebration. We also give them t-shirts after they finish volunteering. And also we, if we have extra produce, we let them take some produce home. And we send out weekly email updates about the weather. And if there's a chance of rain, we'll let everyone know we might have to cancel our garden session. And my garden partner, she's really good about maintaining our hours on Excel sheet. And yeah, it's really great. We have great opportunities there. We're very flexible. We garden once a week, and we also do on-hands training, so you don't have to have experience there as well.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I can say from firsthand experience, Fletcher Place Community Garden is a great place to volunteer. It's about 2 blocks from where I live, so I try to make it down there a few times a year at least. And yeah, I think if with that we can open it up to questions regarding anything that was presented. You're welcome to type your questions into the chat box. Or unmute yourself. Yeah.
If it's okay, I just unmuted myself. This is
Yeah.
Valerie. I'm just curious. I've heard 2 of you now, I think, both say that you were harvesting once a week. We have just found that to be nearly impossible with how much our zucchinis and, cucumbers and things would grow within that week. How did you manage to do it just once a week?
For us, at Bethany, we did start out doing once a week. And as our garden did get bigger and more productive, we have added, like I mentioned, the one woman that takes the produce to the food pantry. She comes on Thursday mornings and she will do a harvest. And it mostly goes directly to the food pantry. Whereas when we do Tuesday nights, we allow our volunteers to select produce first, and then the remaining goes to our pantry partners. So that helps when we have some of the more experienced gardeners to have them come at alternative times. But we have to kind of equip them a little bit, especially in the hot months. If it's, the one pantry is really close and she's got keys, so she's able to go in there and she puts it in their cooler because she helps run that pantry too. So that's helpful to have a shared volunteers. And another thing is when we started, we invited the clients and the volunteers of our partner food pantries, and they actually came. So we were like, it was kind of cool. We had volunteers that we shared then with the food pantry, and some of those people became really key volunteers for us, and they became the people who were transporting the produce from our garden to the food pantry. And that was really helpful. But again, yeah, the one we did find that we needed to harvest more often. So as we've gotten bigger, we've added a little bit more, but we still really want the bulk of our volunteers and especially our new ones to come on that Tuesday evening because we try to have our master gardeners present, and we want to try to have our gardening like an in the garden learning hands-on experience. So.
Okay, thanks.
And then at the Fletcher Place Garden, we have local volunteers that live in the neighborhood that is willing to harvest during the week, like maybe a Wednesday. And we really appreciate that. And they'll take any extra produce to like a local fire station or to our food pantry.
For the different gardens that kind of pass out produce to volunteers, but then also donate to food pantries, do you have an idea of sort of the split in the ratio of how much is going to volunteers versus straight to the food pantry? I guess we've thought about that in the past, but have been a little bit concerned that we would take away too much from the food pantry donations. And I'm wondering how people manage that.
Yeah, we when we first started, it was, we kind of worried. We were like, we realized if we focused too much that we would like if we pulled off what was going to the pantries first, that then there wouldn't be much for the volunteers. So I think that comes back to the mission. And our mission originally was really to teach people in our area how to garden and to build community. Those were kind of our number one missions, but we also wanted to produce enough to supply our food pantries. And the food pantries we were working with, they didn't get a lot of produce before, or the quality of it was not very good. But it helps that our garden is pretty large. So we really generate a lot of produce. We do 5,000 pounds a year. So when we bring it out, and we have to get better at this, like if I'm there on that Tuesday evening, I try to make a point that as the harvesting's coming in, because we weigh it and we log it, and it's kind of laid out on this table or around this table. I want to make a point of going around and talking to the volunteers like, hey, this is a good time for you to go over and select what produce you would like this week, and we've kind of made it, just take what you like and what you will use in your family. And then, generally people don't take a lot. I know that some of them feel guilty taking it. We don't want them to feel guilty taking it because, that's part of why they're with us. And it's probably why we have a large number of volunteers, is that they like eating vegetables. So we want to make sure they go home with some, but we also generate a lot. So that is really helpful. We do need to get better at making sure that they get a portion. So I need to talk to some of the other volunteers to make sure, like, hey, everybody come do your little shopping, and then put it by your car, and then come back and we'll finish up.
Hey, Linda, this is Craig. We also have the individual plots that many of the volunteers rent a plot for $20 for the year. And so they're harvesting there already, so they don't have as much of a need from the community garden.
That's true. Yeah, Craig is one of the co-coordinators of the Bethany Garden. So thanks, Craig. That's good point.
Yeah, and definitely, Craig, that just reminded me of something. I mean, you can have a donation garden. You can have a mixed use garden, I should say. I mean, you can have individual plots that people rent, but then you can have your donation, maybe larger donation plots. And Corey, I would just say, depending on what your harvest is, what your expected harvest is, if you want to be specific about it, I suppose maybe you could think of, and also depending on the number of volunteers that you have, you could create a formula. Maybe 10% of your average annual harvest goes to volunteers, or maybe not even that much, maybe 7 or 8%, whatever seems appropriate, given the number of volunteers that you may have and what you've harvested in the past. I think that would be one way to get kind of a ballpark idea of how to break that down. That's probably how I would go about it, and kind of how I've gone about it in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm sorry, I'm in the dark. I'm at the Corteva garden, and it's sort of the idea of like attracting more employee volunteers out.
Right.
And how do we do that? And but I do like the idea of kind of realigning the mission to also focus on employee health and and what the employees are doing, and rather than just giving them the kind of damaged goods at the end, like we always send first quality to the pantry, and then the second quality gets to go home with the volunteers, but maybe flip the script on that, and not completely, but give volunteers an option of like, come out and you're also going to get to take something home.
We have certain things in the community garden. Linda mentioned raspberries and that, and not a lot of that goes to the food pantries, but those are hard to transport and all that kind of stuff. So most of the volunteers get those kind of things. And then the tomatoes and beans and et cetera that are really useful for the pantries end up, and as Linda said, it hasn't been a problem for us.
Okay.
Not even putting a portion or anything, that is just take what you want, and most volunteers are respectful of the mission, and so they don't hoard, if you want to call it. It's never been a problem.
Okay. That's good to hear.
I think that the other reason we did that, when we first recruited people, like I said, we invited the clients of the food pantries to work alongside us and their volunteers. And of course, we don't know who's who, or if some of them are food pantry clients. So the idea is that, if they are a food pantry client, we want them to be able to have a portion of that harvest. So we need to just kind of assume that if somebody's coming and working with us, that they have a need for those vegetables as well. So they're part of our target audience. There's another pantry that I've dabbled a little working with, and they're a pantry garden. Like, their only mission is to grow specifically for a specific food pantry. And so they don't, none of them take any of the produce, but it's like a group of people who were working a food pantry that said, hey, we want a garden. And so it's literally worked and by food pantry volunteers. So it's kind of a different mission for them. And I don't think that any of them have any of the produce in that, but that's just kind of, they can come hang out with us if they want. They're close.
Another question.
Mhm.
I
Go ahead.
heard a couple of you also mention the T-shirts from one there at Fletcher Place, and then your end of year at Bethany, the gifts and things you're giving out to volunteers. We're working on very limited funding, and certain grants want it to relate to certain things. I wonder where you're obtaining the funding for those types of items.
That's a great question. So we do have some grants that we apply for every year. And then, so we have some funds from that, but we also have a key, we have worked with some of the health systems like Community Health and Franciscan Health. We also work with a federally qualified health center called Windrose Healthcare. It serves southern Marion County and Johnson County and parts of Bartholomew County. The last couple years, they have provided us with an earmarked donation that we use to go purchase those gifts that we use to give to our volunteers. And then we have a big box store that has been a partner with us the whole time, and they give us discounts. So they're able to help us kind of increase the value of that donation that comes from the health center. So basically the health center gives us $300, and then we're able to go to the box store with a significant discount, and then we choose the items that we want to use as our prizes.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
You mentioned on the slide about, I think Bethany Gardens might have mentioned it, about the classes that they provided. I don't know, is that sponsored by Purdue Extension, or was that a homegrown effort? Because I'm thinking about maybe employing that at our location. But I don't want to reinvent the class materials if it's readily available.
Yeah, so when we first started, we were, it was kind of an extension project. So myself and then a colleague that specialized in community gardens, she and I worked with the people down there to start the garden. So as an employee with Purdue Extension, she did teach that first year series for us as part of her position at Purdue Extension. So then she retired. She does still volunteer with us, which is kind of great. So we have also, again, because we did have some grant funding, like the year that we had COVID, we actually hired the Hoosier Gardener, who's a local woman she's really good and has great slides. She's she's really good at online teaching. So we paid her a stipend to present those classes during 2020. And that was super helpful. Actually, that might have been 2021. We probably did that in, I don't know, Craig maybe knows. Anyway, we did it when it was clear that there was no way we could have people gather. So I think we canceled the series in 2020, and then in 2021, we did an online series. And that was nice, and it was good, and it was well attended. It did not bring us the volunteers necessarily. So really having the classes in person was really helpful. But there's a lot of master gardeners that are trained to teach, and it's possible that if you recruit master gardeners to work on your project, they might have the ability to provide that education. Did you want to add something, Craig?
No, I was just going to add, we did things in the garden as well, but you said we had classes. Well, we also had the meal, which you mentioned earlier, which gets people in, something for nothing. But then if they're interested in gardening, and then during COVID, we did have some classes actually out in the garden because we didn't want to have things inside. And that seemed to work well for us. Obviously, COVID has mostly gone down, but, depending on your environment, you can actually just call the volunteers over and say, we're going to have a 15-minute session on how to plant garlic or whatever it is. And that way everyone, they take something home with them educationally besides whatever they're doing to help in the garden. And it builds the community.
I can see that Brooke Alford, who's our urban ag educator with Purdue Extension Marion County, she's posted in the comments. Marion County Farm Bureau has micro grants for community gardeners in the county. It's a revolving timeline and simple application process, and you can email her. Her email's there in the comments for more information. Oh, so this Rainey has a question in the chat. I don't know if you know the answer, Nick, but actually Craig might even be able to answer this. She says, what is required to become a master gardener?
I was, furiously pulling up that information actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there, it's a class series. Do you have the answer?
I will post in the chat. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thanks.
I don't know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question about the classes that you have there. As far as liability, does the church cover people coming in, or is that a Purdue thing, or what? If we had people out for a class to the garden?
Yeah, that's a good question. I assume it's probably the church that's providing us with liability coverage. We actually, I don't think we've talked about it. Thankfully, nothing's happened, but it's their facility, it's their grounds. I
Okay, thank you.
They would be responsible.
I had a question on that same note. Do you have your volunteers sign waivers and have garden rules for them?
We'll have rules for the individual beds for the people who rent them. We do not at Bethany sign a waiver. With another garden, we have done that. That Purdue kind of has a canned blurb that we have used at another garden. It's probably something that we need to discuss at Bethany.
Some of it depends on the equipment you use and that, what are the dangers of what you're doing at the garden.
I can speak from personal experience. As the campus garden manager at IUPUI, I was required to have each student volunteer fill out a waiver, and it was just kind of a general liability, understanding of risk sort of thing, saying that the volunteer assumed risk in the garden. We weren't using any kind of power tools or anything like that, just simple hand tools. So the risk was minimal. But we spelled that out in plain language, and just made sure that every volunteer had signed something. And I just typed into the chat a link to how to become a Purdue Extension Master Gardener. That kind of gives you the beginning steps to start that process.
Hi, I would like to just add, this is Brooke, and I have my camera off tonight because I'm not feeling so hot. But in terms of liability waiving, you can also have sign-in sheets for each work party when volunteers are on site. And at the top of the volunteer sheet is that waiver language. And so that's a simple way to both get people to sign in and get your numbers of volunteers on site, as well as incorporating the liability language, making it a waiver.
Yep, that's an excellent point, Brooke.
I have a question about if you do any food safety training with every volunteer that comes.
In my experience, yes, I did do that through IUPUI. Just general, proper ways to harvest produce, rinsing produce. In our case, we were donating to a campus pantry some of the produce, but then some other produce we were giving to the campus kitchen, and they were using it for special events, or in some instances in the food court. And then some produce we kind of showcased at a little market stand. So I guess I went over basic food handling, food washing safety, just making sure you're, using the same pruning knife, harvesting knife for a certain vegetable, not mixing tools too much, making sure you're rinsing the vegetables that are appropriate to rinse in the garden, and then proper packaging. So it was very basic. It wasn't a certified food handling training by any means. Those are available, but I think particularly if you're donating produce, there is a Good Samaritan law that where there's an understanding between the entity that's donating the produce and the receiving entity that everything has been done to maintain safety, good quality standards. But there are certification programs. I believe ServSafe goes over food handling, washing, and that sort of protocol.
There is a video that's available and provided by Purdue Extension about food safety and harvesting in gardens and things like that. The wearing of gloves and using, scissors and different, making sure that dogs aren't around the garden and different things. And we had one grant that had us show that to all of our volunteers in that first year. Thankfully, they've redone the video because the very first version was super long. So the one they put out last year was a little easier to watch, but there is some information on that available. Which Valerie, what was that? Are you talking about the?
There was a comment up there that says they have a produce safety training for farmers. The classes are free. I just wondered who is they?
Oh,
Where is
okay.
that class? From, is it
She's
Mamie?
still here, Mamie. Is that from Purdue Extension? Brooke, do you know? We probably have one.
Hi, this is Mom Busso. Yeah, Purdue Extensions has a class, and it's similar to the food handler certification, but there's a few things that are different. And it so kind of like what Nick said, is just teaching how to properly handle the produce and some do's and don'ts, especially when you have volunteers. You want to always make sure that they're washing their hands. You have they have access to a toilet and, just some of the basic rules and guidelines to follow. And, if you drop, one thing that was interesting, if you drop produce on the ground, that's not supposed to be given, used. It's just basically just going to the trash, because you don't know if animals are going through the yard so it's a lot of do's and don'ts, but it's very important. We learned a lot as far as I think they have one coming up on the 10th, matter of fact, and the classes are free. So it was offered through Purdue Extensions as well. So I think you might be able to, if you have access to their website or their newsletter.
So I
think
think
her name-
that there's something called Safe Produce Indiana, and Purdue Extension is the lead on that. I'm not sure what they have on the calendar for right now, but we can certainly look into that, and we'll include it in a follow-up email for this collaboration. And if we don't have local programming in the mix quite yet, which I don't think we do, I think that, thank you, Mamie, that's a really good point. And Nick and Linda and I can work on getting something scheduled for our county if we don't have anything easily accessible. So we do have a great team at Safe Produce Indiana, and they do trainings, more intensive trainings for market farmers. But I think that we can also have some more general free classes for community growers.
I think Christina Ferroli is the lead on that for the class that we attended, if that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
You're welcome.
And Brooke, you mentioned for our county, but you've got a few interlopers here from Boone County at least.
I forgot about you, Boone County interlopers. You would be invited as well. Of course, you always are.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Glad you're here.
And I just want to call everyone's attention to the chat. I posted a couple of links there, one to food handler and food safety through Extension, and then also Safe Produce Indiana. Linda just posted something as well there. Yeah. Any last questions? Let's see. Well, with that, I would just say everyone is welcome to email myself, Linda, or Brooke with any questions you might have regarding this presentation. Any suggestions for future topics? We are planning the next ICGC meeting to be in person in late April, and we'll be connecting with you on a specific date in the coming weeks. But at this point, it will be early spring. So with that, I will go ahead and stop recording.